everyone. Welcome to the National Association of Realtors Federal Political Coordinator webinar. Today is October 15th, and we are joined by our esteemed lobbyist groups, Helen Devlin, Joe Harris, and Colin Allen, as well as our policy representative, Austin Perez, on flood insurance, and Ryan Rusbolt and Sydney Barron, all from our lobbying team. My name is Victoria Gibbons, and we will be getting started here on this Federal Political Coordinator webinar reviewing the National Flood Insurance Program. We are also joined today by our outside political consultants, Todd Weiss and Quincy Enoch, who will be helping us out today talking through the inside baseball of the National Flood Insurance Program and all of the ins and outs as we approach a new deadline. I am going to turn it over to start. Before we start and I turn it over to Austin, I want to go over a few administrative things for the webinar. If you have a question, we are going to wait for questions, to address your questions at the end towards the end of the webinar after our consultants present. If you have questions, type them into the question and answer or chat feature of your webinar. That is the only way we will be able to address questions today. We have over 100 people on, so we will not be unmuting any lines. If you're calling in by phone, you can always send a follow-up email to me or any of our lobbying team, and we can address those questions that way. But that is how we are going to run the show this afternoon. So without further ado, Austin, why don't you go ahead and start us off here?
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy schedule. As Victoria mentioned, I am the policy representative in DC for NAR, and I'm bringing you greetings from Hampton Roads, Virginia, where there's no rain, it's a sunny day, and just because it's high tide and there's a storm offshore, there are several areas that are 2 feet underwater. So imagine this is sort of a glimpse of the future as seas rise. This is a community that is dealing with tidal flooding that's happening during the day. I mean, imagine your clients and trying to schedule closings or house openings or take clients around when you know that certain roads are going to be closed because they're a foot, 2 feet underwater. So that, I think, is a good transition segue. Why do realtors care about the flood insurance program? Flooding, it happens everywhere. I happen to be in Virginia. We are not right on the ocean. For those of you in the Midwest, I know that Davenport, Iowa has just broken the record of the highest flood stage since 1993. But because this year there's been a lot of snow melt and rivers are swollen and the ground is saturated, you've got historic flooding, and that's in the Midwest. It's landlocked states, and I won't go through the rest of the points on this slide. Why is it in NFIP important to realtors? But I did ask our research team to pull up some data on presidential disaster declarations over the last 30 years. You see that on the slide to the right, where the blue is the flood-related disaster declarations for coastal states, states that border the ocean, versus inland states, states that are landlocked, that share no border with any ocean anywhere. And I was surprised to see that roughly 50% of all declarations of flooding that are so large that the president had to declare a disaster was in inland areas. So this National Flood Insurance Program is important because it provides an alternative to disaster relief, allowing for people to rebuild more completely, more quickly, more fully after a major flood event. I do want to mention that the National Flood Insurance Program has been extended to November 21st. the program must be reauthorized, not appropriated. This is not congressional spending. This is not funding. Taxpayers are not spending a dime on the program to keep it running. It has to be authorized to write flood insurance periodically. So now we're looking at 13 short-term extension, the 13th from September 30th to November 21st. So that's that situation. Just a quick note on legislative history. I know a number of you have been working on this issue with me for a number of years now, so I'll be, very quick about this. Congress can't seem to extend this program more than a few months at a time. There are 3 exceptions since 1998 where it was able to extend for at least 4 years, but over the last 40, 45, 50 times, the program's been extended. The can has been kicked a couple of days down the road. The last time there was this situation was between 2008 and 2012 when the Bigger Waters Act, which I know a number of you know, reauthorized the program for 5 years. The thing I wanted to mention about Bigger Waters is at the same time the program made a number of reforms that highlighted some deficiencies in the current insurance rating pricing system. So we discovered that $63,000 per year is the top rate for a flood insurance policy in the program. We also know after further investigation that that is completely inaccurate. That was the product of 50-year-old technology, pricing technology. It was the best that FEMA could do in 1968. It was based on a lot of research, but as you know, I don't know how many of you have been in the business, but imagine a time where there were no lock boxes, where the MLS was a big book, the MLS Bible sat on a table. There was no handheld technology. You had to use a rotary phone. There were no personal computers or internet. There was no place where you could actually list a property on a web where your clients could go and identify where they want to look at properties. So that was the time when that current rating system was created. So in 2014, Congress did the best it could to roll back the rates a year and then slowly phase them in. They did not fix the issue. They simply took those Bigger Waters rates and pushed them back by 5 or 10 years. So we're now again in a situation of a reauthorization. This is an issue where at this point, because Congress has not been able to reauthorize the program fully or get into reforms up until this date, and there has been some progress, which I'll get into, but up until this date, a lot of the reform is on FEMA side. So some of the things that you're going to hear about a lot more over the next year or so is that NFIP is now replacing those 50-year-old pricing technologies. It's called Risk Rating 2.0. We've been rolling out, sharing this information gradually over time. We're going to have much more to say about that and down the road next year when the rates are rolled out. But the thing that you need to know is that FEMA is trying to fix the problems with the Bigger Waters Act. And it's going to be challenging because a lot of people do not understand what FEMA is doing. And it's a very sort of challenging political situation where some people are afraid that their rates are going to go up and up when, in fact, what FEMA is doing is they are adopting the same technologies and practices that private flood insurance companies have proven and tested in states like Florida and Pennsylvania and Texas. So more on that later, but I do want to mention that there are reforms underway. It's just on the administrative side of the table and less so on the congressional side. So as I mentioned before, there is a little bit of progress. We have a bill out of the Financial Services Committee. Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Ranking Member McHenry worked together collaboratively to come up with a 5-year reauthorization package that includes a number of reform provisions. Their goal was to try to come up with a consensus bill, and they succeeded. They got a 59-0 vote. It's hard for Congress to name a post office with unanimous consent, but Ms. Waters and Mr. McHenry succeeded in putting together a 5-year package with meaningful reforms to mapping and mitigation, and also opens the door to private flood. But is it everything we want? No. Is it an improvement over the status quo? Absolutely. And in this day and age, you really have to start with what you can get. And here's a bill that has broad bipartisan support, and it now awaits a floor vote on the House floor. And I know you're going to be talking a little bit more about the politics, but I do want to mention that we do have a bill that NER supports out of House Financial Services Committee that is now moving through that process. The next slide, I do want to mention that everything we do here in Washington is guided by policy developed by our board of directors and guided by our insurance committee of NER members, which I'm the staff executive for that committee. So what I did is I quickly gave you a snapshot. We have pages and pages and pages of policy on flood insurance, private flood insurance, natural disasters, everything that you can think of having to do with insurance and natural disasters. But what I thought would be helpful to you is to pull some of the key policy provisions. What is the positions of our board of directors on flood insurance related items? So that's the column on the left that you see, is a very quick summary of what the policy is on reauthorization. It supports long-term reauthorization on mapping. It supports more accurate mapping, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through this list. I do want to point out that if you take a look after the call and you have any questions about our policy positions, please let me or Helen Devlin know your questions. I also took those policies and compared them side by side with the bill that has come out of the House Financial Services Committee by Ms. Waters and Mr. McHenry. And as you can see, their bill almost mirrors our policy. So I identified the key provisions of the Waters-McHenry bill side by side our provisions so that you would have a clear look at, does this bill line up with our policy and where? So you have that. Also, I want to touch on, I know you're going to get a little bit more into the politics and sort of the situation going on, but from a policy and structural point of view with the NFIP, I wanted to shed some light on the question, why is it taking so long? The NFIP on one hand is essential to 500,000 sales. As you know, each home sale, each real estate transaction contributes money and jobs to the economy. But at the same time, the program is concentrated in just a handful of communities where flood insurance is required. And it's also in areas where the policyholders are not being charged full freight for the cost of the program. So the Congressional Budget Office, these are the scorekeepers in Congress that Congress looks to ask questions about what happens to the deficit, what happens to the debt. CBO looked at the program, and what they find is that the program is losing about $1.5 billion per year. So that is shortfall between revenue, including premiums, fees, compared to expected costs. Those are expected losses in sort of an average loss year, claims, processing those claims, et cetera, et cetera. And so what you have is a program that has now borrowed over $36 billion from the Treasury in order to offset the shortfall between revenue and claims in the program. Now, why is this a problem? Well, so I have there a chart for you where it shows that roughly 300 counties are responsible for virtually all of the costs of the program in an average year, versus all of the other counties, the other roughly 90% of counties, are actually paying in far more than they actually receive back. So it actually, I'm giving it to you sort of those who are paying a little bit more in than out, as well as those who are paying a lot more in than out, and vice versa. It actually boils down to about 1% of counties, 30 counties, are responsible for the lion's share of claims, and the other 99% of counties are paying far more in order to offset the losses in that 1%. Another way of saying that is 99% of counties is cross-subsidizing 1% of counties. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if you're a member of Congress representing one of those 30 counties, you're going to look at the flood insurance program reform package much differently than if you're sitting in another county or you're not representing one of those 30 counties. And I think that's the challenge at the end of the day, is that everyone agrees that NFIP is losing money, and everyone agrees that there's a badly need for reform, but what they haven't been able to agree on is what the package of reforms would be. So if you sit in those 30 counties, you're trying to keep your rates pretty low. Your constituents are getting cross-subsidized. You're not paying full freight. Whereas if you're outside those 30 counties, then your members, you tend to look at it more from a taxpayer perspective. My constituents are paying into the flood program more than they are taking out. And so that, I think, in a nutshell, is the challenge between those in those 30 counties versus those out. And so that, I think, is where I want to sort of provide a brief summary. The message on the Hill for us is we are urging the House to take up the Waters-McHenry bill, but we will not support a lapse. So we are urging members of Congress, do not let the program shut down. Keep the process moving. We think the bill, we support the bill. We think the bill includes a lot of good provisions. It's definitely an improvement over the status quo. It's not everything we want, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think that there's probably going to need to be some more discussions and negotiations. They haven't quite reached a decision point in the House as to what reforms might be added or tweaked as part of the Financial Services Committee bill. And so I think those conversations are ongoing. So that's what I wanted to share. Helen, did I miss anything, or what did I miss?
I think you got it all. That was great. Thank you very much, Austin. We appreciate it. And like you said earlier to everyone on the phone, Austin is always available to talk about these in much more detail if needed. So thank you very much, Austin. We appreciate it on a busy day for you.
Thank you.
We are going to now turn it over to our outside consultants to kind of go through both the challenges and opportunities in the House, in the Senate, what they kind of see coming down the pike, and to get more at that question that Austin sort of briefly touched on as to what's the deal? Why is this taking so long? So I'll turn it over to Quincy.
Thank you very much. And just like to say, I think Austin did a great job kind of laying out the background on the issue and kind of giving you a little bit of an idea of some of the obstacles, in considering flood insurance. But let's go ahead and a little bit more detail and kind of hopefully give you a little bit of inside baseball. I think one of the things that Austin touched on was the fact that when it comes to flood insurance, there's some places in the country where it floods and there's some places where it doesn't. And that is going to be what informs your position on flood insurance 99% of the time. So this is not a partisan issue, of course. This is a coastal issue versus inland issue. This is a we have lots of rivers in our district that overflow versus we don't have any. That's essentially, where the breakdown comes in terms of trying to figure this out. And I think one other thing that Austin, kind of laid out pretty well is that because of the way that the program works, essentially a lot of people that aren't going to see flooding, end up paying a lot of premiums to try to cover some of those high-risk areas. And so that's always going to be another point of contention when trying to settle some of these issues, and that's actually what we're seeing right now. As was stated, the House Financial Services Committee was able to pass a bill out of committee, and they passed it unanimously, with support from everyone, Republicans, Democrats, coastal folks, and inland folks, which is actually a first that we've seen in a very, very long time. So before I get into the challenges, I just want to note that that's a really good sign. That's better than what we've seen out of the Committee on Flood Insurance in almost a decade. So, first let's focus on the fact that, we're a lot further down the road than we have been. But, there are still some issues because while we did get unanimous support in the committee, once that bill was reported out of the committee, now it's all of Congress, gets their opportunity to chime in. And you're going to have different points of view. And so, what we've seen is some folks representing more coastal areas, have, inserted themselves into the conversation, basically to say, hey, look, we have had some bad times in the program. We're paying in a lot. As these rates keep going up, we're going to have to keep paying more. But, you also have the standpoint where they feel like, hey, maybe we had a storm and we didn't get enough money back. So we didn't get our bang for our buck out of the program. So you're not going to keep making us pay more and more, even though we're not getting our bang for our buck. And so, we've seen a lot of the coastal folks come forward and talk to Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Ranking Member Patrick McHenry to say, hey, we need some more in this bill to address affordability more than anything else, and to ensure that when we do have a catastrophic event, that the program's going to be there and that it's going to help us, and we're not going to see our constituents have claims denied for what we believe to be no good reason. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves in the House now, where we have this product come out of committee unanimously, but now we have some other folks that are kind of stepping in and saying, you know what, this bill doesn't do enough for us. And, truth be told, there's folks on the other side that will tell you, you know what, this bill doesn't go far enough the other way. The people that live in the flood zones are the ones that should be paying for this, and the rates aren't actuarially sound, so we need to get those rates up to match what the risk actually is. And so, you have a little bit of both dynamics now that it's, being considered in the full House. And so where we're at now is that the chair and her committee staff are really trying to look into ways to try to, for lack of a better word, placate those folks in the coastal areas to say, okay, we hear you, we want you to be involved in this process, what can we do to try to make this a little bit better? I think the tension we find there is it did come out of committee unanimously the way that it is. So if they give too much to some of these coastal members, they're going to start to lose some of that support. And I know from talking to the chairwoman personally that it is one of her priorities to make this process bipartisan and to have as much support as possible. So I think while they're trying to work with the coastal members to try to allay some of their fears and their concerns, I don't think they're prepared to just give in to them at the cost of some of this bipartisan support they've been able to garner. So, now we're kind of just in this waiting game where, what can we do? How far can we go? These negotiations don't always go particularly fast, especially because one of the new dynamics that has changed, I think, for the better to stop the program from lapsing is now the funding for the program has essentially been matched up with funding for the rest of the government. And so while those two things are linked together, I think the chances of a lapse are reduced greatly. And so I think people feel a little bit more comfortable taking some time in these negotiations because they believe when the next funding bill comes up, they're going to extend the flood program again along with the rest of the funding for the government. So, I think now we're in a place where we need to make sure that we are reaching out to members of Congress, keeping the pressure on, because the ball has already moved further than it's ever moved before. And so we just got to keep pushing it and keep pushing it and keep pushing it. And I know that, I've been working here in D.C. for 15 years, and some of the issues do not go as fast as we would like for them to. But I'll tell you what, one way to guarantee that you don't get the outcome that you want is to stop pushing. That's one way where you can assure failure. Because if you're not pushing and other folks aren't pushing on getting this program reauthorized for the long term, it's going to lose some of its importance to the members of Congress up there on the Hill. So, kind of where does that put us in terms of looking forward and, what comes next? I think now, we're really waiting to see what comes out of some of the requests from those coastal members as they're still negotiating. One of the other things that was holding up the process that changed was we found out what the flood bill is going to cost, which is going to be $4 billion over 10 years, which is actually a lot lower than what a lot of people thought it was going to cost. And so, that might help us clear another hurdle that could have been there in terms of moving the ball forward in the House. I know that, from talking to the staff of the committee, they would love to see this bill passed on the floor before the end of the year. The only issue with that is there are 28 legislative days left before the end of the year. And so that being the case, in case you haven't been watching the news, there's a couple other issues that are floating around out there. And so, including funding the government and a bunch of other stuff. So I think it's going to be difficult to get to that point. because those negotiations take time. They have to get their staff together. They have to do all of these sorts of things, and they just have a bunch of other things that have moved kind of to the front of the stove, right? And so I think that, we probably are looking at, maybe something in the first quarter of next year, hopefully, and then we can move forward, and then it will kick over to the Senate, and hopefully that will, get some things over there. I know that Todd will definitely have some great insights to what's going on that side. So with that, I'll go ahead and toss it over to Todd and kind of let him give you the layout of what's going on the Senate side.
Thank you, Quincy. Todd, are you there? We do not hear you, but you are unmuted. So, Todd, you can feel free to...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I don't know what happened. Quincy, thank you so much. I think that was a really good summary of where things are on the House side. A couple threshold items first before we get to the Senate side. I think the point that Quincy made, which is very, very accurate and true and helpful on the lapse front, is by tying the flood to the funding of the federal government. And based on the other things that Quincy mentioned that are going on in Washington right now, one of them with a capital I, it is likely that, as we've always done, whether it's a large omnibus bill at the end of the year, or they cannot get to an omnibus bill at the end of the year and they just do a continuing resolution, it'll be date changes and changing of the anomalies. Included in that will be flood. On the Senate side, it's muddy. Excuse the pun, but it's a little muddy. You have the coastal bill that was offered by a number of coastal members, and I think Austin has a chart that talks about the substance of that bill, but it was sponsored by Senator Menendez from New Jersey, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, and then there are a number of other members that have joined on that are all coastal members. It has been met by, I think, probably frustration by industry for a number of reasons. There was and continues to be a view that the initial bill that Senator Menendez and Senator Cassidy introduced would change and would be amended to kind of help deal with some of the industry's perspectives. And as the folks on the phone are aware, beyond realtors, you have a pretty large set of stakeholders that have been working on flood issues for some time. That's one. Two, Senators Kennedy from Louisiana and Senators Rounds from Dakota both have a number of bills, everything from a 1-year extension to a 2-year extension to a 3-year extension, all kind of, in draft form waiting to be dropped. Senator Rounds also has a bill that people have been calling 555, which is a clean reauthorization on flood, a clean reauthorization on XM, and a clean reauthorization on TRIA. On the surface, it sounds like a great idea, and then once you dig further, the folks that are engaged on TRIA, terrorism risk insurance, believe that they can get a 10-year. The people, I would say, stakeholders on flood, certainly like the 5-year reauthorization, but it is clean. It does not come with any reforms, and that has been, I would say a stopping point, particularly based on those members in New York State that are still dealing with Sandy-related issues and wanting to see those reforms. You have also, somewhat unfortunate, but you have today marks 511 days since the last markup in Senate Banking Committee. We understand that there will be one this October, or there's a potential for one. They are looking at right now what would be included, and certainly NFIP is part of that mix. And they're also waiting to see what happens, the Senate is, waiting to see what happens in the House. And obviously Quincy did a great job of capturing all of that, continuing negotiations. You have members, just as Quincy mentioned, I mean, it is a lot less partisan issue, and Austin mentioned this too, than it is a parochial or state-by-state issue. And so you're not finding these partisan battles per se, but you're finding these battles between flood and non-flood states. It's probably moved, as Quincy mentioned, as far as it has in a very long time, which is great. I agree that the cost that came out on it was a little bit lower than people had anticipated. On the Senate side, it's really a question of, can you get those coastal members and folks like Senator Scott from South Carolina and Senator Rounds and Senator Menendez together to come up with a workable solution. And to Quincy's point, the best thing that we can do and continue to do is to hammer away at the points that make up, what the realtors would like to see here, which is obviously an extended program. I think that the Senate is also kind of on the back end of what happens in the House in terms of potential or I guess potential is the best word, impeachment, and whether that slows things down or doesn't slow things down. And, the Senate, not unlike the House, is also looking at, the election cycle and seeing what issues are important and which states are red and which states are blue and which states are purple, and how does everything that's happening with the Trump administration play into that. And you would not think that flood or the extension of NFIP would play into that, but it does to a certain extent because, as Quincy mentioned, we have something like 27 or 28 legislative days left, and it's a question of what's a priority or not. But, from our perspective, it's just continuing to hammer away, and it's continuing with the great work that, the in-house folks at the Realtors do, and with a little bit of help from myself and Quincy and others. But it's to be active and to be engaged and continue to discuss, because at the end of the day, these negotiations in the House are likely going to drive what happens in the Senate. With that, I will pause and hand it back.
Thank you so much, Todd. That's fantastic. We're going to move on and you can start kind of thinking of your questions. We already have some coming in as we then turn it over to Helen to talk about our strategy with all of that.
Yes, so again, thank you, Quincy and Todd and Austin for kind of laying out which isn't the most rosy of scenarios, but I think it's the reality we're facing, that there's a lot of difficulty trying to actually get something forward. But our strategy is, as both Quincy and Todd mentioned, is we just need to keep that drumbeat going. And even though it's something that we've been talking about forever, we're all pretty fatigued of talking about it. It has made a difference so far, as they pointed out. Members know that it matters. Members know that we can't let it lapse. That it's a given that it won't lapse as long as it's part of this budget. But we just need to keep doing that, keep the drumbeat going, keep negotiating, keep working towards trying to get that long-term reauthorization. Some of the activities we've done so far, as you know, is we just trying to do something a little more creative, following on your all's meetings that you guys had in August, where this was a talking point, and in May. We asked the state presidents to send letters to everybody in your congressional delegations as well, just so that members are hearing from a range of knowing realtors at all levels and in all places, do have the same message and care about this. We're going to have some more activities along the way. Our next we have our convention coming up in just a few weeks. The next deadline for this flood extension isn't until after our convention, so that will probably be the next time we'll have any different new updates or messages for you. But thank you. I know it's been a long haul on this, but the more pressure we can keep on, at least it keeps everybody to the table and keeps everyone talking. We appreciate it. I think.
Perfect. Yeah, just one thing that I wanted to address as we move into questions here, before we move into questions, is where you can find out more about, like, obviously the latest is always going to be in your newsletter. But there was recently, we did a window to the law on the whole flood insurance program. There is a one-page brief that you all have seen that was updated just 2 weeks ago. If you're looking for material to get to your members of Congress, you're saying, what's new? What can I really be saying? Obviously, that's what we're talking about here, but if you really feel like you need paper, that paper is on nar.realtor, and you can send that along as a reminder of where we stand. And always be on social media. You're posting, you're tweeting, you're engaging with them, and we have all those resources in your FPC toolkit. That's the realtorparty.realtor, your FPC toolkit. There is a flood insurance tab there, and you should be able to access infographics and the hashtags that we were using a few months ago for August recess. They are all still relevant. Everything that you were using for your recess talking points is still relevant and worth beating the drum on. So I'm going to read a couple of these. I think we may have answered some of these questions, I feel like, as Quincy and Todd were talking, but I just want to make sure that we address them. And we had somebody ask, functionally, how does the bill increase assistance for repetitive losses? Do you want to take that, Austin? Austin, are you still on there specifically for that question? Can you hear us, Austin? Eric, that was from Eric, and we can definitely get to that specifically on. I know that's a very kind of niche question, and we don't want to take up a huge amount of time getting into that because it's not 100% relevant to what you all need to be talking about. No. And we can
we'll get
email
you more
you that.
Detail. I mean, in general, it helps with, there's more funding for mitigation. There's more programs out there for assistance. And there's more, to help you the first time you've had a problem, there's more help for you to try to harden your home and increase your mitigation efforts so that you don't have a repetitive loss in the future. I think that's what it is for the most part. And having a better mapping thing will also help with there. But we'll get you the actual specifics with Austin. But in general, that's what he's referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
And then just for those, one of our FPCs says he feels like his congressperson is on the Financial Services Committee, and he finds himself sort of preaching to the choir a lot of the time. And so what is your advice for people like that who have people who have supported us in the House all through and through, and what can they be doing? And
Yeah, I think we absolutely can. What we can do is, you can thank your member because they've already voted. Anybody who sits on the Financial Services Committee, they've already voted. So we can thank them, if they're on the Democratic side, thank Chairman Waters because as everyone here has said, this is the first time that any of us can remember that a flood bill got a unanimous consent out of the committee. And thank the ranking member, have them thank their chairman and thank their ranking member for their work on this. and ask questions. You know, we're happy to, we can work with the political reps to get you, everyone who's on the Financial Services Committee or with a member who's on that, some more details if you'd like. But that's a good point. You're right. Sometimes the message gets hard. Quincy has some ideas.
One other thing that I would suggest is, you know, asking your member ways that you could be helpful. You know, I mean, they're going to tell you they are all about it. They want to get the program reauthorized for long term, but, you know, there are some bumps in the road. So I would just advise you to ask them, well, what can I do? Like, who should I be talking to? You know, you guys have realtors all over the place. They know that. You know, what's the pressure point? Like, how can we break the logjam? A lot of times when you ask your member of Congress that, they'll have some good ideas. You should be talking to this person. You should be talking to that person, things of that nature. So I would certainly put that on your list. And the other thing I would add is make sure that you're talking to them about that. I know you guys have a great fly-in and you come out here, but make sure you're talking to them about it when you're at home. Make sure that when you're in the district, you're talking about it, so they know that, you know, when they're at home, you know, and they see their realtors, this is an issue. It's not just something that, you know, the lobby groups in D.C. are talking about. It's something they're talking about back home.
Perfect. That's great. I think the only other question that we've gotten is whether or not the slides will be shared, and they absolutely will be. A recording of the presentation will be going around. It will be posted on the FPC hub and will be shared through the email link. Everybody who registered and has participated on the webinar will be given the recording through your email as well. So it will be shared widely. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. You can reach out to me or anyone on the lobby team or your field reps if you have any questions that you might think of after getting this download today. But we wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page and have this informational session about a very important program that we all care greatly about. So thanks so much for joining, and we will see you in San Francisco. Bye.